A woman shot her neighbor through a locked door. Was it self-defense or premeditated murder? This is the Susan Lorincz story. Hi, Amy.
Hey, I think I know this case.
I think everybody in the universe might know this case right now, especially
not
if you're...
Not by name, but by name of documentary, probably, right?
You're going to know the name of the documentary. And I think it was like one of the top watched documentaries maybe a couple weeks ago, and maybe probably for more than a week. But before we get, though, to today's episode, I want to give a big thank you to the patrons who showed up at our first live event at FDU. That was really cool.
It was. That was great.
Our event was great. I mean, I really want to send a very special thanks to the 3 women who bravely discussed their lives before, during, and after prison. Wasn't it incredible?
Yeah, and people liked the episode, too. We heard some good feedback. We weren't sure how that was going to go, but James did an amazing job with the audio.
He really did. It was a lot. He did an incredible job. And I really thought like what we learned that night, especially what we heard from other people, too, took us beyond stereotypes, assumptions about people who are in prison, and I feel like led to a lot of understanding about real trauma, too.
And you got to meet my dad, finally.
Your dad and stepmom came. That was so cool. One of the pictures on our Instagram is with your stepmom on stage with us. It's the funniest thing. I'm like, look at Lori there hanging out with us.
Yeah, very cool.
I also learned something very new and interesting from the event. It was a term that one of the women used. So after hearing Nafisa discuss calling re-entry new entry, I was just floored by that. She explained that everything was new to her when she went back to society. She had to learn how to function. And so she doesn't call it re-entry. She calls it new entry. And I'm just going to say that I'm going to be using that term now, too.
Yes. And as she said, I don't know if you know, she gave a shout out to the person who coined that term is a man by the name of Anton Henshaw. And he was one of my first students when I taught college and prison. And he is one of the most brilliant minds I've ever taught. And he's doing some incredible work on the outside now.
You know what? I do remember that now. And I remember.
And that was cool that she gave him credit. Because when she said it, I'm like, hey, I've heard that before. And then a minute later, she, gave credit where credit's due, which is super cool.
I think that's super cool, too. Okay. I loved the event. I look forward to doing it again. Something like it, a panel discussion. It's a lot of work to organize, but I really think it was worth it. So,
it was.
Okay. For today's case, both victim and offender are females here, and the dynamics of their relationship played out in this documentary that we referenced titled The Perfect Neighbor. I watched the doc for this episode. I'm sure many of our listeners did as well. And I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about this at our next meetup with our supporters. For now, though, I'd like to introduce the woman behind the headlines. Susan Lorincz is a woman whose quiet life in Ocala, Florida, masked a growing storm. Neighbors knew her as solitary, often irritable, and increasingly hostile towards the local children. But who was Susan really? Well, there isn't a tremendous amount of information about her background, but here's what I can say. She was born in the 1960s, and she had at least one sister and one brother from what I could find in public records. Her childhood was not a good one. There was a history of mental illness, substance abuse, as well as physical and sexual abuse in her home. So very, very challenging childhood, just to keep in mind. So there was a lot of trauma in her background and definitely a rough childhood. At the time of the events we're discussing today, Susan lived by herself in a rental property where she also worked remotely. There's been some mixed reporting about what she actually did. From what I could see from a couple of sources, it looked like she worked for an insurance company. The city of Ocala, where she lived, is predominantly made up of horse farms and the equine industry. As a mid-sized city in central northern Florida, about 80 miles north of Orlando, the city is economically mixed and racially diverse. And though Susan was an older white woman who resided alone, her neighborhood was predominantly young minority working class families. And to Susan, the many kids who played outside in the field adjacent to her house were a serious problem. Susan had moved onto the street in 2020, and within the year, she developed a bad relationship with many of these children who lived on her block. She was constantly yelling at kids who ranged from toddlers to young tweens, as she didn't like them playing on the fields that bordered her property. Susan seemed to believe that their ordinary play was this conspiracy to drive her insane.
Mm-hmm. So it wasn't her property by any means.
It was not her property. It bordered her property.
Okay.
It actually was the property of another resident who had no problem with the kids playing there.
Oh, I didn't even know. I thought it was maybe common space, but it was actually someone else's property that allowed
From
it.
what I understand, it was a mix of both. There was some common space, but there also was a chunk of this property that belonged to another neighbor who was fine with it. There was very much an attitude in the neighborhood that they were happy. These kids were outside playing all the time. And as you hear in the documentary, it's like they weren't on TikTok and they weren't, they weren't up to no good. They were just kind of being kids. But there was a lot of kids in her neighborhood. She lived in a family-oriented place. So Susan did not like them playing near her property. She placed no trespassing signs around her own property. And with the constant yelling she did, many of her neighbors described her as the quintessential neighborhood wicked witch. And it didn't stop, though, at just yelling and putting up signs. In 2021, Susan called 911 to report that the local children were causing a disturbance, creating too much noise and trespassing on her property. I'd like to point out, this is a 911 call.
I was going to say, can't you just, I don't know, if you really needed to, can't you just call local authorities for that? Let's not clog up 911 for that, right?
There's also, I don't know how it varies from state to state, but right in New York, there's 311. When you have like noise complaints and other complaints, they're considered, complaints worth investigating, but less serious than a 911 call.
Yeah.
Okay. But this wasn't just a one-time occurrence either. Susan called the police upwards of half a dozen times over the next 2 years, with many of the police response exchanges caught on body cameras. During these exchanges, the police were polite, but they usually explained that the children were playing off of her property and there wasn't really much they could do unless the children trespassed or did something else against the law. But while police came out to her house over and over again, Susan's hostilities only increased with her calls. And they began to increase from noise complaints to complaints that the children were yelling at her and threatening her.
And is there any evidence that was true?
No.
Okay.
And I'm not saying there wasn't a time when something didn't happen, but no evidence that I could find publicly. From the children's accounts, though, and by Susan's own admission, Susan also shouted racial slurs at these children, and that included calling them black slaves on more than one occasion. Yes.
And if that was my children, I would have went crazy. Like, I'm assuming some of these parents got involved at this point.
I don't know to what degree. They were all aware of her, and it seemed like they all kind of prepped their children on how to handle her and stay away. And they got involved in terms of speaking to the police, absolutely. But they all had an attitude, or most of them seemed to have an attitude. This woman is a nasty, racist woman, and we're sick of it. We're sick of her calling the police on her children.
Mm-hmm.
And while she lodged complaints about many of the children in the neighborhood, she seemed to have the biggest issue with one particular family, the Owens family. The Owens lived across the street from Susan, where Abagail, known as AJ, was a single mother of her 4 children, Isaac, Israel, Titus, and Africa. Ranging in age from 3 to 12 years old, her kids played in that shared yard, retrieved lost toys, and sometimes crossed what we might call invisible boundaries created by Susan Lorincz. AJ was described as a supermom. She worked full-time in the restaurant industry and sacrificed a lot for her kids so they could enjoy extracurricular sports and activities. She was present for all of these things. She was like the team mom for the sports events. She was extremely close with her children, and she worked hard to provide them a good, loving home. But Susan didn't see it that way. In her repeated calls to police, her complaints often focused on the Owens children being too loud or walking their dog on her property. You'll see this in the documentary. One time she called the police and reportedly told them that she thought the children were trying to steal her truck. And the police were kind of there, and it seems like they were also confused. And she had like video of them maybe getting close to her truck, but it's kind of a moment in the video where the police are like, you guys trying to steal her truck? And some kid's like, we're 11. Like, how could we steal a truck, you know?
It sounds like she was just doing anything she could to get rid of these children.
But yeah, I mean, to what end though? You know, she lives in the neighborhood with them, I guess. I think her goal was to get them prohibited from stepping into the space that bordered her property. Mm-hmm. Okay. Things really escalated out of control, though, on the evening of June 2nd, 2023. The children had been playing in the field next to Susan's home when she came out and shouted racial slurs at them for causing too much noise. You also have to see, by the way, in the video, a police officer asks her if she used the N-word, and she said, yeah, well, it just slipped out. And I think he's kind of even like, how does that just slip out? You know, it wasn't a good moment.
Is that not harassment or like hate speech or something?
It's not criminalized in the way, I guess, that she was using. It's just disgusting, obviously. Okay. So the children left on this evening, but once they got home, 9-year-old Israel Owens noticed that he'd forgotten his iPad in the field. It wasn't there when he went back, and he believed that Susan had taken it. So he went to her house to get it back. And at that point, he said that she threw the iPad at him, possibly hitting him in the foot with it. There was mixed reports on that, but also that the screen cracked. He also stated that she threw a pair of roller skates at him. According to Susan, she said she tossed them to him, something of that nature. I mean, I don't think this was a pleasant exchange. Mm-hmm. Now, his 12-year-old brother reportedly confronted Susan saying, if you want to throw something, throw it at me. I think he was sticking up for his younger sibling. And Susan responded by swinging an umbrella at him or in his direction. I think she's pretty careful not to hit these kids with it, but she swings objects at them, hurls things at them. At that point, the boys retreated to their home as Susan called 911. In her first call at 8:54 p.m., Susan told the police the following. I've got kids trespassing, leaving all their toys around, just screaming, yelling, just being absolutely obnoxious. I went and threw the roller skate over to the other side, and the kid says he's going to beat me up for that, and he's mouthing off to me. I feel threatened in my own home. She went on to say that there are several kids out there right now. I'm fearing for my life. I'm very scared.
And you said these kids range in age from toddlers to 12?
Yes, about. Okay. Now, the 911 operator, taking this seriously, when someone says they fear for their life, the 911 caller takes it seriously. So they told her to stay inside her home, lock the doors and windows, and then an officer was on the way. But minutes later, Susan called again, this time saying, oh my God, this lady just tried to break down my door. I shot through the door. Oh my God, the woman was screaming and yelling at me, trying to break down my door. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my gun and shot at the door because I thought she was going to kill me. On the other side of the door, AJ Owens was dying from the bullet Susan had just shot through her metal door while her 9-year-old son stood beside her. AJ had come across the street to confront Susan about throwing items at her children. She knocked on Susan's door multiple times, demanding that Susan come out to discuss what she had just done. And though Susan knew authorities were on their way from her first call, she'd grabbed her .380 caliber pistol and shot through her locked metal front door.
That's not self-defense.
Well, we'll see. Okay.
You said this was Florida, right? So
exactly.
I have a feeling I know where this is going. Just so you know, I didn't finish watching the documentary. I started it. You told me you were covering it, and I stopped. So I actually don't know exactly how this goes down.
Okay. Her son was standing next to her. And I want to say, sorry, I said 9-year-old Isaac before. Some reports said he was 9. Some said 10. So while I can't be certain, I just want to clarify that. In any case, either a 9 or 10-year-old Isaac ran to his neighbor's house for help as the other neighbors immediately called 911 and gathered around AJ as she gasped for breath on the ground. And you can hear and see this in the documentary too. It's really awful. While paramedics arrived very quickly and rushed AJ to the hospital, she did not survive the gunshot. Her children, seen in the documentary, were absolutely devastated, with Isaac saying that his heart was broken. It was so sad, Amy. It's so sad. It almost brings tears to my eyes. In all seriousness, the horrendous grief the children felt was palpable through the screen in the documentary when their father had to tell them that their mother wasn't coming back. AJ's family and the entire neighborhood were shattered, left wondering how could this have happened? And more importantly, what was going to happen to Susan Lorincz now? The neighbors anticipated that Susan would be arrested immediately. She just shot AJ through the door and AJ died. But that did not happen. The police did interview her right away, but Susan contended that she feared that AJ was going to kill her and that she'd shot her in self-defense.
So you said the door was locked. Is there any evidence that she was trying to break down the door or that AJ was picking the lock or going through a window? Is there any reason for Susan to have believed that her life was in danger?
No. The only thing she articulated was that AJ was loudly knocking on her door. Okay. You might say banging, but there was no other attempts. And I believe she was banging on the door saying, "Come out and talk to me about my children." So it seemed clear that Susan also knew what this was in reference to. And this metal door, we'll talk about it later, would become kind of central to the investigation. Now, if this was another state, Susan might have, or likely, I think, would have been arrested on site. But as you pointed out, this is Florida. And Florida is home to stand your ground law, passed in 2005, which allows a person to use lethal force if they reasonably fear imminent harm.
Yep. We covered a case not long ago from Florida that talked about these exact issues. Do you recall?
Yeah, it was your case. Was it Marissa Alexander? No.
Correct. Yep.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, it's very complicated. These stand your ground or castle doctrines, they're very complicated.
Very complicated. Well, we'll get to a discussion of that for sure. But the police right now had to figure out if Susan had cause to be afraid for her life, or was this more of a malicious murder? So after interviewing Susan, they investigated the scene, and they also interviewed the two eyewitnesses, which were AJ's children, Israel and Isaac. They also reviewed all of Susan's complaints and 911 history. And 4 days after the shooting, on June 6, 2023, Susan Lorincz was arrested and charged with manslaughter, culpable negligence, battery, and 2 counts of assault. I watched the footage of the arrest, and I have to tell you, it's very surprising. What's surprising is that when told she's under arrest, she's in the police station and they're speaking with her. But when told she was actually under arrest and that they were taking her to booking, Susan responded that she wasn't going. She wasn't going anywhere.
Oh. It doesn't work like that, Susan.
Right. So she refuses to get out of her seat for some time, in fact, saying she couldn't go, she didn't feel well, and she wasn't going to move. One officer responded perfectly, in my opinion, telling Susan that the decisions she made were simply not reasonable. And I think that was so perfectly said.
Yeah.
She finally gets up of her own accord, and she was officially arrested. She would then await trial in jail. Susan's trial began mid-2024 and lasted for several days. I think it was just under a week. The prosecution described an attack without merit, a murder rooted in anger and not fear.
Do you know if she was offered a plea?
I don't believe she was offered a plea. No, and I don't think she would have taken one if she was offered one.
I don't think so either. It does not seem like I believe that she believes she did absolutely nothing wrong. I don't think she would have taken a plea.
You know, interestingly, the police offered her the opportunity to write something to AJ's children when she was arrested if she wanted to. Do you want to say anything to them? And she wrote like a note like, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I did what I did. I feared for my life." It was just like that, you know, the justification. So I'm not sure what more we would have expected. So the prosecution focused on Susan's past history, her string of 911 calls on the neighborhood kids, as well as her obvious disdain of the Owens family. They also relied heavily on the physical evidence that was the door. The heavy metal door that could not have been penetrated and that showed no signs that anyone was trying to break it down. There was no dents. There was no scrapes. There was nothing to show anything that someone was knocking on the door. The 911 calls were also played for the jury to hear, so they could hear Susan in her own words. But the defense mounted a case based in the stand your ground law, and they tried to show that Susan was fearful for her life.
Are you going to talk about what the law explicitly states? Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that, yes. So the defense pointed to the loud pounding on the door and how that could scare a woman who lived alone and had a history of conflict with her neighbors. And so possibly a woman like this might feel afraid. A neighbor was called to testify. She said that she heard AJ yelling loudly at Susan's door to bolster this claim, and she heard the banging on the door. The defense also presented expert forensic witnesses to testify about the distance from which Susan shot through her door. Susan claimed it was at some distance from her kitchen, so she couldn't steady her aim or tell where the bullet was headed. And her expert witnesses opined that she did not shoot from directly in front of the door, as the prosecution asserted.
And that would speak to what? Motive?
Susan said she was afraid, she was scared. She grabbed the gun, ran to the kitchen, and just shot. Where the prosecution's saying, no, this woman was angry. She got a gun. She stood right in front of that door, and she aimed for AJ.
Mm-hmm. Wait, was there any glass on the door? Could she actually see through it at all?
No.
Okay, so she didn't know exactly where AJ was. Meaning, she couldn't aim perfectly.
I don't think it was a perfect aim, but AJ was in front of this door. So, but we also know that each expert is going to have a different opinion. The expert on the side of the prosecution is going to say she stood right in front of it. And the expert on the side of the defense is going to say, no, she was nowhere near it.
Was the defense trying to say that these were warning shots, or they didn't even go down that?
No.
Okay.
They were just saying that she wasn't a woman who stood there and took aim. Gotcha. She was a woman afraid, shaking, who shot a gun from quite a distance.
Okay.
The defense also had a psychological expert who testified about decision-making in stressful situations and how past experiences can impact these quick decisions. After 1 week, the trial was over and it was in the jury's hands. So what would they decide? Well, not in Susan's favor. She was convicted of manslaughter by the jury and faced up to 30 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Susan's sister testified that she and Susan had grown up in a very unstable home and that they'd endured a lot of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of their father. It did seem, from what her sister said, that things were very bad for Susan and her family. A friend of Susan's described Susan as a wonderful and caring woman who had never shown any proclivity towards violence, while a psychiatrist who evaluated her said that she suffered from PTSD as a result of her childhood abuse, and that did impact her reflex decision-making. These were presented as the mitigating factors to try to lessen Susan's sentence, why she should not receive the higher end of the range. But the presiding judge was not persuaded, and he sentenced Susan to 25 years in prison. Susan was 60 years old at the time of the trial. The presiding judge said that the shooting was completely unnecessary, and he told Susan he believed that she'd acted more out of anger than fear, which I think was an interesting assessment. But the story didn't end with a verdict. It rippled outward into advocacy, media, and a community still searching for peace.
Were there people on both sides? I'm assuming that Susan had supporters as well.
So
or no?
I don't know that she did. From the documentary, no. From what limited I saw of the trial, I don't believe so. I believe she had some supporters that were maybe family or friends. I read a lot of news articles, and I didn't really see any support for Susan. I think even people who strongly support stand your ground laws did not maybe feel this was the poster case for that.
Okay.
AJ Owen's death sparked outrage, but also action. Her mother, Pamela Diaz, became a voice for justice and an advocate for reform, founding the organization Standing in the Gap Fund, which helps families impacted by racial violence and those organizing against race-based violence. So the families who are, suffering, but also those who want to do something about it. AJ's children reside with her mother now. And Susan Lorincz, well, she remains behind bars, but not out of the headlines. So, as we said, the Netflix documentary, The Perfect Neighbor, was released in October 2025, and it went straight to the top of the charts. AJ's mother, Pam, gave her full endorsement of the film in hopes that it would open eyes and inspire a real change. I think this is such an interesting film. It is told almost entirely from body cam footage. And it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, it's hurtful. There's a lot of things that make you uncomfortable, but you have to sit in the discomfort sometimes to see what's wrong. And so I really commend Pam for endorsing this film. She's also filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Susan, to which Susan responded that she intends to file a countersuit alleging slander, libel, and defamation of character. Her claims or her reasoning is that the children were trespassing and lied in their depositions about that and other facts. She hasn't filed official suit yet.
I don't even see how that would change anything. She's just trying to get money out of this.
I don't know. I don't know that it would change anything. Maybe she's trying to negate the wrongful death claims by, trying to show that the children lied about some of the facts and that she did have a right to fear. Mm-hmm. Or maybe she's just angry that she was convicted. So what do we take from this? A law meant to protect may have enabled harm and a neighborhood dispute that became a national reckoning. So let's turn to the law that is at the center of this case, stand your ground. And I know we talked about this in a previous episode, but it has been a while, so I'd like to summarize again. Stand your ground was enacted in Florida in 2005 with almost 30 states to follow. And as I said earlier, it allows a person who feels an imminent threat of death or great harm to use self-defense.
On their property.
So, no. There's no duty to retreat if a person is in a public place or any place they're entitled to be. So not just their property. As you mentioned, in your home, what you're talking about is the castle doctrine. And we have castle doctrine, which means that there's no duty to retreat if you're in your home. But there's also some variation in the way this doctrine is by state. So while every state has a form of castle doctrine, this can vary as to whether someone's in their home or vehicle, perhaps their place of employment. There's also there's different criteria for what constitutes a threat in your home as well. There's also variations based on the relationship with an aggressor. So meaning like the right to use lethal force might be dependent on whether or not the aggressor is or is not a cohabitant in the home. So there are variations in the castle doctrine. But stand your ground expanded this right to self-defense. I think we might view this as going from a spatially limited self-defense to a mobile subjective standard in shifting from defending your home to defending your ground, wherever that ground may be.
And this is tricky though, because it's such a subjective standard. Like how do you apply that? Like
it is
because it seems difficult to apply.
It's very difficult to apply. Well, it's always difficult when we're saying also a reasonable person, right? That's the subjectiveness, because what I may perceive as a threat, maybe you don't think is a threat at all. So you have to use this reasonable standard. And as the officer in this case said to Susan, you don't make reasonable decisions. It's not reasonable what you thought. So I think it was almost clearer in Susan's case, but I think there are other cases where it's a lot less clear what a reasonable person would feel as fear. And again, this sounds good in theory, but we can see how very different the outcome is in reality. So taking this back to the case, AJ Owens was a mother, a neighbor, and a woman who knocked on a door too loudly. I mean, in basic form or in the most basic understanding of this case. And Susan Lorincz was a woman who answered with a gun. And I assume will likely revisit that decision for the rest of her life. At least I hope she will.
I'm assuming she will appeal. I'm imagining she already is in that process.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure she is. So between the two stood a law that ended up serving neither of them, if you think about it. This was an awful and senseless loss of life that left 4 children without their mother and a community reeling. And I mean, the community was devastated. It certainly brings up the question, do stand your ground laws make for safer communities? That's the question. So I did a little digging because, of course, that's what we have to look at. The answer is no, according to a major empirical study by the Journal of the American Medical Association. So their findings showed that stand your ground laws were associated with an 8% to 11% national increase in monthly rates of homicide and firearms homicide.
Do you talk about that example in policy analysis? It seems like a perfect example of a policy that has unintended consequences.
I haven't, but I think possibly I will now because I do a whole unit on firearms and gun policy. But I never really thought to incorporate this. And yeah, thank you. It's a great suggestion. And I think it's a pretty staggering statistic. And one we hope encourages our listeners to maybe learn more about stand your ground laws in your state. There are a lot of feelings about this. I don't want to get too personal. The castle doctrine is something I do believe in, though. I believe in my right to protect myself in my own home. Fundamentally, let's put it that way. I have a fundamental belief in it. Stand your ground laws extended this to an area that is very tricky and very unstable. Let's put it that way. And I think the consequences and the outcomes just have not been what we would hope for. They're just unintended. Not that we would ever hope for those kind of consequences, but I think they are somewhat dangerous. But listen, we invite people. I am certainly not an expert on this area. And we would, again, invite people to check out your own laws and know your laws. Check out your castle doctrine, check out stand your ground, look at the statistics, do the research. We have such an active audience, so I know they're going to. We'd also invite the audience to check out Standing in the Gap, the fund that supports AJ's family and other families in similar situations. And we're going to put a link to that in our show notes. Nothing can ever restore AJ to her children, but I hope that by sharing her story, as her mother had hoped, that we can bring awareness to the kinds of behavior that caused AJ's death and possibly prevent this from happening somewhere else.
I'm watching the documentary tonight. I think I only got like 15 minutes in and then I stopped it.
Did I tell you to stop watching it? Oh, was that what happened? You were watching it and then I said, don't watch it because I'm doing this episode?
I think we were talking about it and I was like, you've heard about I'm watching this new documentary tonight. And you're like, oh, I'm doing an episode on it. I'm like, okay, then I'm not watching this new documentary tonight. So I guess I went back to Sex and the City.
Well, I think that happens with us a lot, right? Like you've covered a few where I've started watching and I can't wait. I'm like, oh, goodness, I'm not going to be able to wait. But I'm glad you waited on this one. And we look forward to all the feedback from listeners, supporters. We look forward to discussing this case with you in the future. Before we go today, though, Amy, we have a question from one of our supporters. One of our supporters has been around for a while. So we're happy to take this one.
We have a lot of them. We have a lot of them. It's great.
I love our group. I do.
I know.
I'm so grateful. Okay, here's the question. Isn't it true that a lawyer can't defend you if they know you're guilty, but they still represent you to get a fair trial? So this is a great question. You want me to take it or you want to?
Did we just have this conversation recently or was that in my brain?
We did. Okay. I knew we did, but I couldn't remember where.
It was on the phone and we didn't see eye to eye. Do you remember? It's like one of the few things like we were talking about the purpose of a defense attorney.
But that's different. That was a different question. This one is because this one's specifically asking, can a lawyer defend you if they know you're guilty?
Yeah.
And the answer is absolutely they can defend you. And in fact, lawyers defend a lot of guilty people. Here's what they cannot do if they know you're guilty. They cannot put you on the stand to testify and subordinate perjury if they know you're going to be dishonest. And I think that's the reason why a number of attorneys I know will say, don't tell me if you're innocent or guilty, because then they can't put them on the stand, and that's not an option. While there are definitely attorneys who need to know right away and feel like they can't craft a defense, it's a different strategy. But yes, they can absolutely defend guilty people and do quite often.
And as she pointed out, she did say something. What was the last part of the question? Was a statement that she said about a fair trial?
But they still represent you to get a fair trial.
Yeah. So that goes back to the purpose of a defense attorney. They need to ensure that your constitutional rights are not violated and that the procedural safeties are in place.
So that was the debate we had in a recent episode. And by the way, Lindsay wrote in to us. I love it, our resident defense attorney.
Yes.
Kind of taking.
saw that.
I think she kind of took both of our sides on that one. So thank you, Lindsay.
I know.
And thank you for that question.
Yes.
And if you have a question for us, feel free to message us at womenandcrimepodcast.com. And as a reminder, if you're a patron at the Life tier, your question is guaranteed to be read on air. There's also a lot of other perks, though. Consider joining us on Patreon. We get a lot of great feedback. We just had an amazing coffee and crime breakfast meetup, which we really haven't done before.
Our most attended, sorry to cut you off, it was our most attended event to the state.
Yeah, people like the coffee and crime, which is great because we're often struggling to stay awake around 7 or 8 o'clock at night these days. So we'll be hosting more of those. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to catch you next time on Women and Crime. Women and Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include the Ocala Star Banner, the Ocala Gazette, the documentary The Perfect Neighbor, several articles from People.com, and the New York Times.